This essay is from Rakesh Krishnan Simha, who is a globally cited defense analyst. His work has been published by leading think tanks and quoted extensively in books on diplomacy, counterterrorism, warfare, and economic development. So I am going to read his essay, uh, which was published in Bharat Voice. Suicide by election. Why democracy poses an existential threat to Hindus. By Rakesh Krishnan Simha on May 16th, 2023. I'm going to read his essay now. Hindus have faced multiple existential threats over the past millennium, from the ramaging Huns who destroyed Takshashila to the murderous hordes of Islamic invaders and Christian colonizers, such as the Portuguese and British who destroyed the Indian economy and society. Hindus have faced them all and through sheer grit have defeated each of them. How did Hindu society prevail over these powerful forces? Well, first, first of all, the Hindus knew who the enemy was, whether it was Mahmud Ghazni, Alauddin Khilji, Aurangzeb, Tipu, or the British. It was easy to identify the enemy because he came with the sword or the gun, killing millions, ravaging the land, and enslaving millions more. So Hindus fought them with all their might. But over the past century, a silent killer has been at work, destroying all the gains made by Hindus in their wars against the foreign invaders. I repeat, all the efforts. This is, I just want to convey the message of this essayist in my word. I'm now recoining his phrase. All the efforts that Hindus are putting in have put in their effort to defeat their enemies now is getting diluted in a complicated process which is called democratic process. That is to say, that democracy is full of hurdles and obstacles and making our life more and more difficult to attain the goal of prosperity, common prosperity of all people is going to be delayed, and that is the author calls it that assassin is democracy, which has empowered the defeated forces of Islam and Christianity through elections, which are the number one cause of minority appeasement. Assassin is democracy, which has empowered the defeated forces of Islam and Christianity through elections, which are the number one cause of minority appeasement. For 1,000 years, we have defeated this Islam and Christianity. Those people who belong to Islam and Christianity are now getting bolder and bolder by the day because of the minority appeasement which is necessary to win elections. In a pre-democratic form of government, the minorities would have behaved like a normal group, enjoying basic human rights but without stepping on the toes of Hindu majority. However, electoral politics allows the minorities to act like a vote bank and influence results. They thus develop a false sense of power and over the majority and start making unreasonable demands. Another major threat that democracy poses to Hindus is that elections are an incentive for the minorities, especially Muslims, to outbreed everyone. Because elections are a number game, the more Muslims and Christians there are in a constituency, the easier it is for the non-Hindu parties to win the poll. This is most starkly visible in Kerala, where Muslims have grown from 20% of the population a generation ago to 30% today. Kerala Muslims thus not only have a lock on the citadel of Malappuram, where they are an overwhelming 70% majority, they are also a decisive factor across Kerala, making it at all but impossible for the BJP to win a Lok Sabha seat in Kerala. Democracy is a drag that prevents India from achieving great power status. According to Lee Kuan Yew, the late Prime Minister of Singapore and one of the greatest strategists of the 20th century, India has suffered greatly due to electoral politics. In the words of the Singapore strongman, the exuberance of democracy leads to undisciplined and disorderly conditions, which are inimical to development. I repeat, the exuberance of democracy leads to undisciplined and disorderly conditions, which are inimical to development. In Lee's view, democratic procedures have no intrinsic value. What matters is good government. The government's primary duty is to create a stable and orderly society where people are well cared of, their food, housing, employment, health. Democracy is one way of getting the job done, but if non-electoral procedures are more conducive to the attainment of valued ends, then I am against democracy. Nothing's morally at stake in the choice of procedures. In this book, Lee Kuan Yew, the Grand Master's Insights on China, the United States, and the World's by Graham Allison, Robert Blackwell, and Ali Wine, there is a chapter on India. In this classic, Lee says, in his no-nonsense style, India has wasted decades in state planning and controls that have bogged it down in bureaucracy and corruption. A decentralized system would have allowed more centers like Bangalore and Bombay to grow and prosper. India is a nation of unfulfilled greatness. Its potential has lain fallow, underused. Lee believes the culprit is uncontrolled democracy. There are limitations in India's constitutional system and the political system that prevent it from going at high speed. Whether the political leadership may want to do, whatever the political leadership may want to do, it must go through a very complex system at the center and then even a more complex system in the various states. Indians will go at a tempo which is decided by their constitution, by their ethnic mix, by their voting patterns and the resulting coalition governments, which makes for very difficult decision making. Furthermore, populist democracy makes Indian policies less consistent with regular changes in ruling parties. Nation building, no easy task. During a rally in 1980, Lee described what it took to transform Singapore, which was a small, dirty colonial trading post, into one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him or give it up. This is not a game of cards, this is your life and mine. I spent a whole lifetime building this, and as long as I am in charge, nobody is going to knock it down. Lee walked his talk. Under him, Singapore became a de facto one-party state. He disallowed dissent, curbed free speech, introduced corporal punishment, and even banned chewing gum. Was he a tyrant? Benevolent dictator would be a better description. For Singaporeans loved him for raising their living standards and, more importantly, their prestige. Lee served in office from 1959 to 1990, during which time he led his country through a period of remarkable economic growth and diversification. When he took over as Prime Minister, Singapore's annual per capita income was $400. Today it is estimated at $56,000 per capita. The road not taken. If Singapore had taken the democratic route, would it have been as chaotic as India? Would it have been less prosperous? For the answers, let us turn to Russia and how it first experimented with chaotic democracy and later opted for strong central rule under President Vladimir Putin. When democracy arrived in Russia after the collapse of communism in 1991, it was pretty much free for all. The country was under the grip of criminal syndicates and sundry opportunists. The economy remote controlled by the IMF and the World Bank was in free fall without the bottom in sight. So, Russia was an easy prey to hunt for the Western predators. And yet, in the Western view, God was in his heaven, and everything was right with the world. The suffering of the Russian people did not matter to them. Rather, the pictures of once proud pensioners, now reduced to trading their World War II medals for a loaf of bread, were gleefully published by Time, Newsweek, and The Economist. Those who have been in the war front defeating Germans, those Russians who were victorious of the Germans, they were reduced to trading, selling their medals, World War II medals, for a loaf of bread, and the Americans laughed at this. Putin walked into the mess. His entry was dramatic. The Russian stock market jumped 17% the day he got the job in 1999. During Putin's first stint in power, from 1999 to 2008, the Russian economy recorded an average growth of 7% annually. During this period, industry grew 75%, while real income more than doubled. The monthly salary of the man in the street went from $80 to almost $600. The IMF, which worked overtime to destroy Russia's state-owned corporations and banks, admits that from 2000 to 2006, the Russian middle class grew from 8 million to 55 million. The number of families living below the poverty line decreased from 30% in 2000 to 14% in 2008. Today, despite the impact of the Ukraine war, the Russian economy has not collapsed. Russian banks have not folded, and Russian companies are well placed to survive the global recession. How did Putin achieve that? First up, he rejected the notion that Western democracy and values are universal. He opted for strong central rule from Moscow because traditionally the Russian people have preferred a strong man at the helm. Russians by nature are undisciplined and require a leader like Putin to steer the country. Without a powerful center, Russia tends to descend into the chaos and lawlessness. This is precisely what Lee had done in Singapore. As the Singapore Prime Minister was fond of saying, I do not believe you can impose on other countries standards which are alien and totally disconnected with their past. In his view, to ask China to become a democracy when in its 5,000 years of recorded history never counted heads was completely unreasonable. The problem with the West is that it treats democracy as religion, so sacred that it will bomb countries into the Stone Age in order to sow the seeds of democracy in those places. That is what George W. Bush claimed the Americans were doing in Iraq. The Americans and the NATO friends claimed they were introducing democracy in Libya. Both attempts were spectacular failures. Flawed idea. In a democratic form of government, the party or candidate that gets the most votes is the winner. Such a system may seem fair, but in reality can create unfortunate outcomes. For instance, a large number of candidates can divide votes so that a totally unpopular and unqualified candidate can squirm his way to victory. This has happened most starkly in India, where the Congress party ruled India for over 6 decades, despite not getting the majority of the votes. In the US too, Western style democracy could not prevent the theft of the 2000 presidential elections, where Al Gore got more votes than George W. Bush and still lost. Lee spoke against such imperfect election tools during an interview in 1999. My view is that people's preferences matter, but I don't define the people's preferences as merely the views of existing majorities. The people, as I say, it includes future generations, and governments have a special responsibility to resist popular pressures for tax breaks and welfare measures that undermine the prospects of future generations. So, perhaps we should define democracy as a government chosen by the people, including contemporary and future generations. In contrast to Lee's strong sense of nationalism, India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru was completely delusional. Instead of raising living standards, Nehru spent his time and energy on the chimera of world peace. Today is described as the breaker of modern India. Unlike Lee, Nehru lapped up what his former colonial masters dished out to him. He imposed Western democracy on a poor and divided country, causing chaos that slowed economic growth and caused numerous caste and religious conflicts. Endgame. A leader who protects his country's interests is not necessarily a tyrant. General Augusto Pinochet, a Western stooge who killed thousands of Chileans, was a tyrant, no doubt. But Lee and Putin came under the category of nation builders. There is a difference between Pinochet and Lee and Putin. Indeed, because of the dramatic economic growth of Russia, China, Singapore, and other Southeast Asian countries, authoritarian prosperity rather than democracy is now a viable governing option for developing countries. It is yet another example of the rejection of Western ideas by the emerging world. Around 2300 years ago, Chanakya, the master of statecraft and the mentor of the Mauryan Empire, wrote in the Arthashastra, the foremost duty of a ruler is to keep the people happy and content. The people are biggest asset as well as the source of peril. They will not support a weak administration. It is ironic that Lee, a man of Chinese ethnicity, internalized Chanakyan strategy. But Hindus only make internet memes on it. Chanakya, the master of statecraft and the mentor of the Mauryan Empire, wrote in the Arthashastra, the foremost duty of a ruler is to keep his people happy and content. The people are his biggest asset as well as the source of peril. They will not support a weak administration. So, democracy is breeding a weak administration and they will not support it. That's what Chanakya would have said in clear words. States like Kerala are not lost in a day. It can take decades of rampant Muslim population growth to reduce the local Hindus to electoral insignificance. Hindu are a minority in 9 of India's 28 states. By 2047, growing Muslim and Christian numbers may well create multiple Kerala across India. The sooner Hindus reject electoral politics and opt for indefinite central rule, the better it would be for their long-term survival. It would also allow our leaders to concentrate on nation building and pursue India's destiny as a great power without being distracted by the endless roller coaster of state and general elections. That's all. This is the end of this essay. We have to really consider now whether it is useful to keep this democratic process yet in India or just throw it in the dustbin and opt for a strong one party based rule in the central administration, central government.